Welcome, my friends, to our panel discussion, Insurrection and Religious Extremism. How did we get here and where do we go? My name is Jack Moline. I am president of Interfaith Alliance, and I am very pleased to welcome my guests here today. Sarah Posner, who is the author of Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Helio Fred Garcia, who is the author of Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It, and community activist and philanthropist, Sabi Singh, who is talking to us from San Diego. Fred is in New York, and Sarah's in Washington, D.C. suburbs in Maryland, and I'm coming to you from Alexandria, Virginia. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. And those of you who are watching, those of you who are joining us, you are invited to submit questions as we go along through the Q&A function. The chat function will not work, but if you submit them to Q&A, we'll do our best to get to them at the end of our conversation. And so I want to jump right in because we only have an hour. I want to start with the most important question, I think, which is, how did we get here? Each of you has been looking at this situation from a different perspective for quite a while. Sabi, I know, for example, that you were in Oklahoma City when the bombing at the Murrah building took place. Do you recognize anything that is similar to the time we're living in right now?
It was just beginning. People were becoming aware of this current, I think, and that brought it into sharp focus. 120 whatever people it was that perished in that, including children, made people aware of. People say jokingly that that was when people got to know where Oklahoma City was, and sure enough, that was the case. But I came to this country in 1975, and I happened to live in Michigan. I go to school in Michigan, and Timothy McVeigh, who lived in one of the rural areas from Michigan, and that, of course, at the time I was there, I had no awareness of that, but I think I could recognize what was going on, and unfortunately, that's how it kind of started.
Like you, I'm old enough to remember the beginnings of being aware of groups like the militias in particularly the upper Midwest. Were people in Oklahoma City aware of these elements, or did it come as a pretty much complete surprise to people?
It was a surprise. And when it actually happened, there were reports of a dark-haired, foreign-looking man who had put that truck there or something, and that's who they were looking for. And then they found Timothy McVeigh in his pickup driving away, or his car driving away. And I seem to remember that was the thing that sparked off the formation of the Interfaith Alliance, that event. There wasn't an Interfaith Alliance chapter at that time in Oklahoma City, but there were some people who were concerned that the immediate reaction being to look for a person who was considered a Muslim, and at that time, Muslim terrorism was in topic of discussion. And so that's what led to the Interfaith Alliance chapter opening over there.
That's correct. That's correct. Sarah, you've been studying this phenomenon. Could we have seen this coming?
Well, I think we could have seen the attempt coming. I think the way it played out in terms of the law enforcement failure, I think that piece of it shocked everyone. But in terms of the attempt, I think we should have seen it coming, because Trump in particular validated and mainstreamed the worst of white supremacists and Nazis in our country. I think they clearly would not have been as emboldened as they were last Wednesday without Trump's validation. And the validation wasn't just his speech at the Ellipse before the siege, where he told them to go march on the Capitol and fight like hell. This has been 5 years in the making, from the moment he came down the escalator in Trump Tower and called Mexicans rapists and criminals. This is what enthralled the racist right about Donald Trump's candidacy. And he just persisted throughout his campaign and presidency in making these organizations and individuals feel like they were no longer fringe, that they were part of the mainstream.
If he had not made that kind of speech that day, could we have anticipated that people would have responded by marching on the Capitol?
You mean if he hadn't given the speech on January 6th?
Yes.
I think it was months, weeks, well, weeks probably. It was 2 months from the election, but several weeks, at least 6 weeks of agitation on the right over the election having been stolen, and a lot of ugly rhetoric about who was to blame and who was at fault, and what true patriots needed to do to take their country back, or to make sure that their country did not fall into the hands of communists or Marxists or whoever the particular enemy or scapegoat was in the particular rhetoric involved. So I do think that the fuel was there, and the fuel had been accelerated by Trump himself, not just on January 6th. And so we're not talking about one moment of instigation, if that's what your question is. It wasn't just that speech. It was building for a while.
And that sort of brings me to you, Fred, and your work on lone wolf whistle terrorism. This was an event that activated lots of people. Is it your opinion, having studied the rhetoric that goes around Trump's agitation, that we had a lot of people coming from different parts of society who'd been activated by his rhetoric? Or was this something that seemed to you to be more of a mass appeal type of thing?
I agree with Sarah that the event itself can't be seen in isolation. And one of the things that I study is the patterns of influence and the patterns of audience reaction to charismatic leaders. And those patterns have explanatory power, where you could look back and make sense of something, but they also have predictive power. And one of the patterns that I've noticed is Trump actually began before the escalator. He began by delegitimizing and demonizing Barack Obama. And that activated the white supremacists who previously were skeptical of Trump. And then when he came down the escalator, that got the attention of the white supremacists. And when he called for a total and complete ban of Muslims, when he called for building the wall, that got the white supremacists on board. But beyond the white supremacists who self-declare, and who, by the way, took credit for his victory, in many ways, Trump has been grooming his followers the way an abuser grooms victims, and getting them to be more and more likely to accede to accepting things that were previously unacceptable. So one of the things that I point to in Words on Fire is 12 forms of language that have historically and preceded acts of mass violence. And the patterns of how those forms of language preceded the mass violence was to condition a society to accept and condone and even commit acts of violence against groups or rivals or critics who have been demonized and dehumanized. And part of that grooming is obliterating the validity of sources of reliable information. So whether it is the news media are fake news or enemies of the people or treasonous, he has conditioned his followers to not accept the reality that others see. And so when he says they stole the election that I won in a landslide, which is demonstrably false, his followers believe it. And that creates the condition where they think they are doing something noble, but in fact, they are being manipulated by the demagogue. And the scholarship of national security and law enforcement of how a terrorist mindset is shaped is they go through 4 phases. They see some social condition and say, that's not right. That intensifies into that's not fair. That intensifies into it's their fault. And then it becomes they're evil, they're less than human. And that activates people to want to take matters into their own hand. What is unique about Trump is that he doesn't lead people to those conclusions. He actually uses that language, and that intensifies and accelerates their mobilization to take action. And so when he says the vice president is going to let us down and we'll lose our country, there's this direct line between that and hang Pence, hang Pence, hang Pence.
Oh, wow. Now, this is not your first constitutional crisis. That's not a statement too many people can make. You, when you were a young man, were a page in the House of Representatives during the Watergate hearings. How does the climate about the presidency and the role of Congress compare this time around to what you remember from the Nixon crisis?
So Jack, I was 17 years old on the floor of the House of Representatives, by the way, working for the Republican caucus. And it was eye-opening to see the process by which a president was impeached and ultimately chose to leave office without violence in the streets, without the military being mobilized from either side. But what is different now is, again, for 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen private citizen Trump and candidate Trump and then President Trump care not at all about norms, care not at all about structures of government or of civic life, and obliterate all of that. Nixon, for whatever his faults were, when his Republican Senate and House colleagues went to the White House and said, Mr. President, you got to go, he realized his political career was over. He even used that language that it's become clear to me that my political support in the Senate is no longer there. Therefore, I've chosen to leave the presidency. There's no such consideration on Trump's part. So if anything, I look back at my time during Watergate summer, and I look back and think that that was just so quaint compared to what we have now.
It's an interesting word to use to describe the resignation of a president of the United States. I've been listening for 4 years, for 5 years, to people say that what President Trump has been promoting, which is primarily himself and his peculiar approach to the United States, is not something that he invented, but it is a wave that he sort of was able to ride. What was it at this moment in history that you would think created this situation where it was Trump and it was that crowd? What was it that led us to this point now? Sarah, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, Trump came along at the same time that we were seeing a wave of right-wing nationalist autocrats take power or try to get power across the world, in Europe, in Russia, in South America. So that's part of it, obviously. I don't think we can dismiss the international dimension of this. But I think in terms of domestically, I think we got here because Trump energized and validated white supremacists and Nazis who live in America, people who belong to militias, the 3%ers. But he would not be here, and we would not be here if he had not had the support of white evangelicals and conservative white Catholics and the other Christians who make up the religious right. Because if he had not had their support, he would not have gotten the nomination. He would not have had the benefit of their get out the vote operations. And I think it's really important for people to understand that the religious right stood by him and stuck with him through every moment when it was obvious that he was wallowing in the support of white supremacists, from Charlottesville, from more minor moments throughout his campaign to Charlottesville to the Capitol siege. And that they played a role in brainwashing the base into believing that Trump was anointed by God, that Trump is under siege by his political enemies, and to believe in conspiracy theories that put Trump at the center of victimhood and persecution and put them in the center of playing or acting out or carrying out the idea that they are saving America, they are the true patriots, and they have to act in order to do that.
So now would be a good time to remind people by holding up your book that you've actually written extensively on this. None of us here identifies as a traditional Christian, as an evangelical Christian. But is there something that is different about, if not Christianity, evangelical Christianity, that makes something like this possible? Or is it the supremacism of privilege that has impacted the kind of support you're talking about?
I think there are some uniquely American features of American evangelicalism that have brought us to this moment. One is the contention, and this is also like a sort of a revisionist history that America was founded as a Christian nation. It was divinely anointed as a Christian nation, and that changes that took place over the mostly over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, were a threat to the Christian nation, and that it was the duty of every Bible-believing Christian to take back America for God, basically. And so those changes are, things like civil rights, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, secularism, greater religious pluralism. So in each of these moments in history, when these changes were taking place, you see a backlash from white evangelical Christians to those changes. And it's rooted in this belief that, America has turned away from its Christian heritage and we need a savior to return it to its Christian heritage. And they saw that in Trump. But I think at the same time, there were new evangelical movements within evangelicalism more broadly. And these laid the groundwork for believing that Trump, as a wealthy businessman, had been blessed by God. So that's a byproduct of the prosperity gospel, this sort of belief in the rich celebrity being blessed by God. And just broader changes in televangelism and charismatic Christianity, where people believed in divine revelation, that they were modern day apostles and prophets who received direct revelation from God and were being told to act in a certain way in the political arena, and that it was their duty as Christians to take dominion over various aspects of public life, including government. So I think all of these factors converged together to bring us to where we are.
And I think it's important to note that there are lots of other variations of Christianity than American evangelicalism. And that even within evangelical Christianity, it was not a uniform support for the president or a following of these trends that you are talking about. I don't want anybody to think that the four of us got together to bash the most prominent faith in America, but
I think it's important to note that of all religious subgroups, white evangelicals are more monolithically Republican and are more monolithically supportive of Trump in the 70 to 80% range.
Fred, was it this moment in history and Trump himself, or is this something that you've seen building as a rhetorical and political thrust over the course of, you tell me how many years?
The way I describe it in Words on Fire, and I guess I should also...
You should show your book.
The way I describe it in Words on Fire is I believe that there have been three social trends that I refer to almost as a braid that come through the last 30 years. The first is a migration of the incentives in television news from primarily a public service orientation to a spectacle and ratings-driven orientation. And that shift meant that spectacle overtook significance in public discourse, at least as we experience it on television. The second, which plays into the first, starting at about Newt Gingrich's becoming speaker, was the extreme polarization of electoral politics and political leadership in government, where compromise was seen as weakness and where demonization of your rival was seen to be appropriate. And that played right into the incentives for spectacle, and that is conflict drives news coverage. So those two things together essentially fed on themselves over the last 30 years. The final third element of that is a decline in critical thinking skills and civic understanding among the electorate. It's gotten to the point where schools no longer teach critical thinking. The explicit platform of the Republican Party of Texas in the year 2012 was to prohibit the teaching of critical thinking skills in schools. And when we see an entire political movement begin to say science isn't real, that evolution isn't real, that human life begins at a different phase a different time than we thought it did, that global climate change is fake, that this dismissal of science is part of the decline in critical thinking skills. But I also point to Orwell's Politics in the English Language, who pointed out many years ago that political language tends to diminish critical thinking skills, which in turn invites more political language, which in turn diminishes critical thinking skills. You put these three together, and then you add the narrow casting of social media, where we self-select that which we marinate in, and that led to an explosive situation. And Trump just came in and capitalized on that. He's not the cause of this, but he is a foreseeable, predictable consequence of this.
Sabi, you've lived in Michigan, where the militia movement had sort of dug its heels in. You spent a considerable amount of time in Oklahoma City, which became, for a while at least, the epicenter of white supremacism. And now you're in Southern California, which also has its own history of very hardcore conservative politics and belligerent politics, for lack of a better word. Are you seeing similarities, or is this a new phenomenon from your perspective?
I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I came in 1975, like I said, to this country. And so when I compare the general tenor of conversation of people on, again in the media, again in Congress, there's been quite a change. And I know there have been periods before 1975 when there was a lot of polarization and all of that. But I think the factors that I would say are deeper than what Trump basically made use of. And those factors are economic. I see a fair change, and everybody's aware of that, caused by globalization, export of jobs abroad, by social ferment, social change, by immigration, that the people that I got to know in Michigan as a student, when I came here, I was befriended by a blue-collar family as a student. They chose to help me do different things, get a car, do this, do that. And when I think about their mindset and what I saw, I can see I've lost track of them now in the last 5-10 years, but I got to know them in, like I said, in 1975. And I can see how they would be fodder for somebody like Trump who wants to manipulate them. And not just Trump. I mean, Newt Gingrich was he just didn't get to this level, but he was exploiting a lot of this. And so I think unless that problem is addressed, that's a real problem. You know, a lot of us who are educated and who are relatively well off tend to forget that there is a very large segment of the population that, whereas people who are in the right place have made a lot of money off technology, there's a lot of gap. That gap is what I think Trump exploited. I know we're talking about religious extremism, but there's been religious extremism since the Crusades and whatever else, the Inquisition. But this is based in something deeper that has affected people. And I think if you're trying to address what's going on, how do you tackle this? That has to be part of the equation.
Absolutely. You point out very well that there's been so many changes in our society, that there have been so many things that we've had to adjust to. And people, even who are using this technology right now to be a part of this conversation, have access to it and have reached a level of comfort with it. But we were just talking before this panel began about how quickly we all had to adapt to the ways that we interact with each other now through technology, instead of being able to gather in person and to travel and to see each other. Change is hard for everybody when the foundations of what you rely on for your day-to-day sense of place in the world have shifted. Anybody who can offer you a way to go back and move forward at the same time has an attractive message. And if he's willing to exploit it, well, this is what we're seeing now. We could talk a lot about Donald Trump, and we could talk a lot about the people he surrounded himself with, and we could talk a lot about the groups of people who have taken advantage of the climate. But they're not on this panel discussion. And our conversation here is not going to change who they are. I want to ask you the harder question, which is the harder question for everybody listening. And that is, what do we need to do, we who are part of rejecting this insurrectionist movement in the United States? What do we need to do to make things better? Fred, can we start with you?
Thank you. When Trump has faded away or disappeared or otherwise is no longer part of our daily consciousness, the problems will not have gone away. That the climate that he has created models for other demagogues ways that they can accumulate power by dividing, by creating dissension. And I worry that this is not the end of the process. This is the continuation of a process that has, as I mentioned, social roots as well as roots in the individuals in question. What was missing from the moment that private citizen Trump went down the escalator and became candidate Trump, what was missing was civic leaders with a vocabulary and with a capacity to call out the dangers in the dehumanizing language and in the demonizing language, and the degree to which that dehumanizing and demonizing language activated people to commit violence. And for as long as I've been preaching that relationship, when I started, the news media said, "Oh, you're exaggerating it. Oh, that's not right. You're just selectively taking this event and that event and putting them together." Well, we now see this writ large, and now we see the explicit connection between the kinds of language that create the social conditions that lead to violence and the lack of holding those leaders accountable, giving them permission. One of the patterns I trace about Trump was, as he got away with it in low intensity ways, he ratcheted up the intensity and the frequency, and that ratcheted up the danger to individuals and to groups and to society at large. What we need to do is what we've been seeing only in the last few weeks, and that is across the political spectrum, across journalism, across civic leaders, to name the danger and to hold leaders accountable for the consequence. And my fear is, because we didn't hold Trump accountable in a sufficiently powerful way when it was small, it got bigger. And now it's tempting to say, well, Trump is gone, the problem is solved, and it won't be. We need to be on the lookout for those who are coming in behind Trump to fill in on that vacuum that will be created when he leaves. So it is about naming the danger, naming the likely consequence of that danger, and then making it clear that leaders will be held accountable if they continue to play into the same ways that Trump does.
You know, it's funny, I was not funny, actually, it's sad, listening to the impeachment hearings yesterday and hearing really people on both sides of the issue, but primarily the Republicans, suggesting that what the president was doing was not so much different from what had been heard from other political leaders over the course of these past number of years. And some of those criticisms rang true, some of them rang a little political, but it's pretty clear that we each have that responsibility. Sabi, what would you suggest that people who are watching now, listening now, need to do in order to make for better circumstances politically and in the country in general?
Well, I think what is needed in this country is what the incoming president has made his reason to be there, which is healing. After an event like this, there has to be some coming together, minimization of the conditions that caused what this was. And there's only a limited role, I understand, that the Interfaith Alliance can play in that. But I'm thinking we need to be able to engage, focus on that issue, and be able to engage people that come to our meetings, that we can interact with. And I don't mean that by having panel discussions or things like that. We need to actively go out into the community. And the mechanism, I think, that I found effective in the year that I served as president of the Oklahoma chapter was to focus on community service, issues in community service, which you approach as a diverse religious community. That's what, when I joined the Interfaith Alliance, that's what it was presented as, and it actually functions as a group of people from diverse religious backgrounds that are engaged in things that will improve their community. And I guess it was partly my Rotary background, which is what Rotary does. Rotary is a secular organization, as a religion has no role in it, allegedly. And but it has been able to address very large issues in the world, like polio plus, which is polio that they were managed to eradicate it through a program that started around the time that I joined them. And so I think if we, and somebody who's done this before is Tony Blair. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of England after he found he had nothing more to do politically. He started this initiative where he got people together and he started it on a global level. And he was somebody who could do that. That he actually got this group together, and they addressed programs like malaria prevention in Africa. They addressed programs like, there was a gentleman in Chicago, the US chapter of it. There was a person by the name of Ibu Patel, and some of you may have heard of him. He was a young Muslim student at that time, I think, and he started what was called the Interfaith Youth Corps.
Still going strong and doing great work.
There you go. And so that was, and he visited Oklahoma City around that time. And so that gave me my idea. I don't claim originality for that, but I said, this is something that we can actually, which will catch the imagination of the community that we live in. And sure enough, I think in that 1 year we were there, and then that program, just to give you an idea, is still there. Those programs we started in that attempt in 2013 are doing okay. They're still running.
Yes.
And so those are the kind of things, I think, where we actually involve people in this. And then what happens is that through osmosis, through interacting with people that they normally don't meet. I mean, there were many people that met a person from a different faith or a different background just through those two programs. And that's what they vocalized, that this has really helped us understand, while we're doing this community service, we are talking with people from different faiths, and we look at a person and see, a person who we might say, who's this guy with a turban walking around? Is he from, so-and-so place or whatever? We now know that he's a Sikh. He's a Sikh from India. And
so let me ask you specifically about that. I'm waiting for this opportunity, and you opened it up for me. You present as the devoted member of the Sikh community that you are. Are you comfortable and confident in encountering people who have been in the Trump camp over these past 5 years? Do you feel that there is a connection that you can make by reaching out to them?
I think so. Yes, all the faiths at the core level we are all humans, and it's this process by which you get to know other people. When I came to this country, I met a number of other Sikhs who had cut off their hair, didn't wear a turban anymore, and the main reason usually was work. They felt that they wouldn't get a job, or they would have trouble with holding a job if they looked different. And I have found it an advantage right through my professional career and the business that I had, and I found it earlier than that. I did a month of what they call it, auto stop in Europe, hitchhiking. And people would stop to pick me up. There'd be 10 people lined up on the entrance to the freeway, and they would stop to pick me up because they found my looks interesting. They were people who wanted to talk to me. And so I think if you approach things at that level, that you are a human being, everybody is a human being, and I guess I have the advantage of my faith, which is a very egalitarian faith. It's not so well known in this country, but that's how my thinking has been shaped. And if I am approached by somebody with a gun, I would be as scared as anybody else what might happen, or apprehensive about what might happen. But I don't think ultimately it becomes a factor when you get to meet people.
Just don't let my mom hear your suggestion that we could learn that by hitchhiking. She'd be, you'd get a letter. Sarah, you are a journalist in addition to being an author, and I'm wondering what you think people listening to us now need to do in order to make things better, and particularly when it comes to news and social media?
So, well, I would say one, when it comes to news, support your local news outlets, subscribe to your local newspaper. In a lot of communities, there are new types of newspapers and news outlets that are cropping up that are, fact and evidence-based. And you should try to support them if there's one of those in your community. Because one of the problems that we have right now is that journalism has been hollowed out, and social media and conspiracy theories have swooped in to fill the void. And so in terms of the news, it's very important with your pocketbook to support real journalism. And with regard to social media, social media obviously has played a significant role in spreading conspiracy theories and spreading lies about a lot of different things, but right now about the election, that the election was won by Joe Biden. And social media has played a huge role in spreading conspiracy theories like QAnon, which we haven't really talked about that much tonight, but also played a big role in last Wednesday's insurrection at the Capitol. So in terms of social media, I would say that it's important for people to understand how social media has played that role, and to demand accountability from their elected officials to regulate social media in a way that would, contrary to what Josh Hawley might say, this does not infringe on anybody's constitutional rights to regulate social media. And to be mindful when interacting with people on social media, mindful of sharing things reflexively, mindful of how you interact with other people on social media. And when I say be mindful of sharing things reflexively, I mean, check it out before you share it. It might be pushing your buttons in some way, and that's how social media works. They want you to feel enraged or to feel animated and to reflexively share things, and it goes against our interests in terms of truth telling and truth seeking to just do that reflexively. And I guess one more thing that I would say is that if there is someone in your life who seems to have fallen into conspiracy theories, that you should try, and not try to the ends of the earth if they won't listen to you. There's only so much you can do. But I wonder if some people who have fallen into conspiracy theories couldn't benefit from a loving interaction from somebody that they trust in their life.
So the answers from all three of you are the same: engage, engage, and engage, which is important. We have a few questions that have been posed to us, and fortunately we have a few minutes for them. Let me begin with this. One of our viewers asks, do you think the insurrection was also a result of long-standing systemic racism that flared when President Obama was elected and served for 8 years? I'm getting a nod from Fred. What do you have to say about that?
When President Obama was elected, there was a tendency to think that proves that racism is over in the United States. And the Supreme Court even argued that when it suspended provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And what we find is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And there were people who were deeply, deeply troubled by that. And that became a rallying cry. And what Trump was able to do was to harness that anxiety for his benefit. But when you look at the normalization of white supremacy through the Trump years, it began when the president embraced the birther movement around Barack Obama. But if you do the polling today of how many Americans believe that the election was stolen from the president, and what percentage of Republicans believe it, you see a huge percentage. When you did the polls of do you believe that Barack Obama was born in the United States, you saw the same thing. And there's no objective way that one could conclude that President Obama was not born in the United States. But that became the rallying cry to delegitimize him. And that delegitimization continued into the Trump years. But what we find now is the normalization of the Boogaloo Boys, of the Proud Boys, that stand back and stand by was taken literally, and they were among those who showed up at the rally. So yes, I believe that much of the energy came from the resentment. That doesn't in any way excuse any of it, but I think we were naive in concluding that because we have someone of a certain identity in a high office, that means everything will be resolved. We need to be even more vigilant going forward.
Interesting. So you would think, I would think at least, that people of faith who saw overt racism and supremacism would be willing to push back against that. Sarah, why was there not more pushback from the most quote unquote faithful segments of our society?
Well, so white evangelicals have been animated by racial grievance since the founding of the moral majority in 1979, and obviously well before that, right? I thought a lot this week about a supposed Tea Party protest that I covered on the National Mall in 2009, some months after Obama took office in his first term, where there was no talk really among the people that I interviewed at this protest about budget deficits or government spending. People were carrying signs with devil's horns on Barack Obama's face or comparing him to Mao or Hitler. So that was not a lot of economic anxiety. That was a lot of racial grievance. So, and polling data on the Tea Party movement showed that it was largely a white evangelical movement. It was not like it was a separate movement. It was sort of one little offshoot of a movement that's been with us for some time. And so obviously I think there are people of faith of more liberal traditions that have spoken out against the racism and the birtherism against Barack Obama. But remember, Barack Obama's own actual faith, there was conspiracy theories about whether he was a Muslim. And then his own actual faith came under attack in a racist way when he was attacked for having attended the Church of Jeremiah Wright, who preached Black liberation theology. So the racist component here has been part of, a central part of Trump's religious support. Liberal religious people have spoken out against it, but there hasn't been a lot of reflection on that on the side of Trump's religious support.
We hear a lot about the younger generations turning away from religious structures and religious traditions. Sarah, is that going to cause some of this to abate because there is less influence on a generation of Americans by religious figures?
It might, and you're right. When you look at data about 18 to 29-year-olds, there's a shrinking percentage of them who are white evangelicals, and that's largely because 18 to 29-year-old age range is less white and also less religious. But there's an asymmetry in organization, right? So like when you have a lot of people who are uninterested in organized religion, they don't have sort of an organized thing going on. The sociologist Phil Zuckerman says, evangelicals go to church on Sunday and atheists go hiking. So the the highly organized structure of the religious right, as well as their deep intertwining with the Republican Party, gives them an outsized influence in our politics. And culturally, they have an outsized influence because of this highly organized structure and money and their own media outlets and so forth. So I don't think that demographics explain it all. So yes, they are a shrinking part of the population, but we should be concerned about why, if they're a shrinking part of the population, they have played such an outsized role in our politics.
Sabi, you're the patriarch of a multi-generational family, and you have children, you have grandchildren. Do you find them to be more or less engaged than you are in these issues?
Let me see. I have a, and I don't think she would mind my saying this. I have a Jewish daughter-in-law who is very much gets a lot of support from her religion.
I have a Jewish daughter-in-law too, just for the record.
Okay. So, and then, but you know, their belief in going to church as part of their religion, for them, it's a personal thing. It's what they learn from the religion, from what are the qualities you need to have to espouse or to nurture. From that your religion says, and all religions say exactly the same thing, or not exactly the same thing, but very similar things. And so the change, I would say, between how I practice religion and how my children practice religion is I would make it a point to go to our church, which is called a Gurdwara, and I would make sure I went there as often as I could on Sunday. That's no big issue for them. I don't think that's part of their Sunday planning. As you say, they prefer to go to a hike than to hike to the Gurdwara. And so, or to the synagogue, or my son-in-law is a Roman Catholic. And so, you know, for them, religion is not they take what I think they should take from a religion. It's not the gathering that has influenced our older generation. We saw religion as the meeting place, the house of worship, as a place for socialization, as well as for religious instruction, primarily the latter, but that's why we went. And their socialization, and by the way, Rotary is seeing exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter that you go to Rotary in a restaurant over lunch, or you go in a bar, or you have it just outside of any meal, or there's no meal associated with it. So I think these kids are learning something from that we had structured, and that's a good sign, that they take what is the essence of what needs to be done, not now I'm generalizing for people that I don't know, but within what I've observed, at least within my circle of people, of the younger people that I meet, I think that's a healthy sign. They're less dogmatic about their religion than older people tend to be.
How do we penetrate the closed loop of information that is a major aspect of our dilemma here? How do we penetrate it?
I would say it goes back to the same thing, Jack, if I might, that we have to stop talking to, well, not stop talking, or using talk, or using preaching as our main way of interacting with people or trying to influence people. We have to do it through hands-on, providing hands-on opportunities for them to interact with people. Now, that doesn't always meet with a welcoming hand, you know. You have to, that's how if we can penetrate through that, provide things that are of equal interest to them. For example, the thing that I mentioned, community service is a thing that I think works across the platform. And if we can make that part of our effort, it's not easy to do. It's harder to do than just talking, organizing a panel discussion or something like that. But if we can make that change within our activities or our emphases, then I think that might be the way to penetrate those people who are not receptive to just being talked to. Talk is easy, they would say.
Sarah and Fred, how do we penetrate that closed loop?
I think that one of the ways that we start to do that is to get people of good faith and critical thinking and, belief in facts and reality interested in public service. I think what we've seen in the Trump era, particularly, we saw it before, but I think it kind of culminated in the Trump era, was, people who are just, conspiracy theorists or bad faith actors holding public office. Think of the number of the members of the House of Representatives who refused to walk through the magnometer the day after the insurrection, who attack their colleagues in these ugly ways, who talk about carrying guns in the Capitol. I mean, so these people are members of Congress, but we're also seeing that sort of phenomenon at school board, city council, state legislature level. And I think that is a product of the right being very mobilized in recruiting and training people to run for office, but not training them to revere public service. So I think that that's a place to start, because if you don't have people who are, climate change deniers on school boards, or people who believe in QAnon in the House of Representatives, you can start to make changes that we'll need to see. But this is a long process, because
Right.
a lot of these people are very embedded in non-reality and conspiracy theories.
Fred?
And I agree with Sarah. I would add one more, and that is that civic leaders need to hold the mediators of information accountable for enforcing their standards. So, for example, I believe it is outrageous that it took Twitter until last Wednesday to ban the president from using his account. There was nothing in his language Wednesday that was materially different from the language he used before. What was different was the venue. And there was a really interesting experiment in early fall. And that is, a guy created a Facebook account and a Twitter account. And all he did was take the president's tweets and take out the president's name and post them on Twitter and Facebook. And he was immediately shut down by both. But the president got a carve out. And we need to be attentive that those who are mediators, whether it is the mainstream media or the social media operators, that have standards of what is appropriate, should be held accountable for uniformly enforcing those standards and not giving the president or any other leader a carve out simply because they're afraid of losing their own support from his base.
This has been a remarkable hour. I thank all three of you for taking the time to spend with us, and to those of you who are watching and listening, whether you're doing so live or you're doing it on our website, where it will be resident after this evening. Sarah Posner, Helio Fred Garcia, and Sabi Singh, thank you so much for joining with us. If you're interested in the work that Interfaith Alliance has been doing for more than 25 years and continues to do, protecting your faith and freedom, true religious freedom, please visit our website at interfaithalliance.org and give a listen to our weekly radio program and podcast, State of Belief, which you can hear on local stations and at stateofbelief.com. Thank you all once again.